Hello, everyone. Hello. Hope you've been enjoying your day so far. So for this session, we have of poison and perdition. Very alluring alliteration. So the first paper is The Sweet Poison of the False Infinite, C.S. Lewis and Longtermism, presented by Aidan Arthur of George Fox University. Aidan Arthur is a undergraduate at George Fox University, where he studies biology with a minor in English. He is also a member of the George Fox's Great Books Honours Programme and tracks and field and cross-country teams. He spent the summer of 2024 researching C.S. Lewis and Longtermism under the mentorship of Jason Lepoja and Benjamin Giudice, with financial support from the Paul K. and Evelyn E.C. Richter Memorial Funds.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here after a very long trip from Oregon. I'd like to correct. When I sent in the submission, I used the word long-termism. I'm going to be using the word transhumanism, so I don't want that to be too confusing. I'll touch on long-termism, but I think transhumanism is a broader category I'm going to be speaking within. So I'm going to open with 1 Corinthians 15:51. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Humanity's developed many stories about the end of the world, and most of these try to provide meaning to our human lives by placing them in the context of an unfolding story. Christianity specifically tells us about a fallen world that's going to be made new through the resurrection of Christ, which places us in the gap between original perfection and ultimate redemption. But these stories don't have to be religious. The largely secular ideas of transhumanism and long-termism have captured the imagination of many people in the 21st century. C.S. Lewis's work, though written almost a century ago, does well at combating transhumanist ideas from a Christian perspective. However, the history of transhumanism is surprisingly intertwined with Christianity as well. In this paper, I will discuss the eschatology of transhumanism and place it in the context of C.S. Lewis's work, particularly his Cosmic Trilogy and the Abolition of Man. First, I'll define transhumanism and give a brief history of its development. Then I'll examine it through Lewis's work, and then finally I'll offer what I think transhumanism can offer that Christians should take note of, which is how they approach their eschatology as something to be worked at, not just waited for. The word transhumanism was supposedly invented in 1957 by biologist Julian Huxley. In his words, it describes man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. This encompasses two complementary parts of our cosmic duty, one to ourselves to be fulfilled in the realization and enjoyment of our capacities, the other to others to be fulfilled in service to the community and in promoting the welfare of the generations to come and the species as a whole. This ideology had been gathering steam before Huxley, spurred on by the discovery of evolution and the idea that it could be guided to benefit humanity. Long before Huxley or Darwin, however, Dante invented a similar word in Paradiso, trasumanar, a verb meaning to pass beyond the human, which Dante meant in the context of a redemption in heaven. This origin is highlighted by Ronald Cole Turner, who writes that the concept of transhumanism grows of necessity from the defining claim that lies at the core of Christian revelation. This is not just based on a stray word in Dante, however. In the late 19th century, Orthodox theologian and scientist Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov argued that resurrection was not a passive promise to be accepted from God, but a call to action for humanity. Eugene Clay writes that for Fedorov, the incarnation meant that God had delegated to humanity both the power and the responsibility to raise the dead and renew the cosmos. This now became the common cause uniting all humanity. Later, transhumanism became the territory of secular scientists such as J.B.S. Haldane. Haldane was also a biologist, who Lewis mentioned often in letters and essays. These references weren't all negative. Lewis called the 1927 essay, The Last Judgment, brilliant, though to my mind depraved, and referred to Haldane approvingly as an opponent of evolutionism. But the largest part of Haldane and Lewis's academic relationship was disagreement in both directions. The Last Judgment is a short story in which Haldane imagines two future societies. One remains on Earth, living happy lives, but harnessing natural resources in a way that ends in their destruction. The other society, seeing this approaching, starts to control their own evolution to fit them to survive on other planets. They eventually set up a colony on Venus after many failed attempts at space travel, and they form a sort of collective hive mind where they operate for the greater good, and they plan to go out and colonize other planets and ideally just keep on going forever. So Haldane refers to these people on Venus as a monstrous ant heap, but he nevertheless portrays them as much wiser than the Earthlings who live out their lives on Earth and eventually go extinct. Lewis points this out, that Haldane shows a lot more sympathy to their side. And this is an early version of transhumanism, I believe, a realization of our cosmic duty and our potential as a species. And it prominently features genetic engineering. Haldane also, in his more short-term work, Daedalus, or Science in the Future, laid out a plan for genetic engineering and modification of humans. Today, most transhumanists, or I should say many transhumanists, support enhancement technology that feels like science fiction. They've largely abandoned the evolutionary roots or the genetic modification, although not entirely, possibly because it was associated with the eugenics movement, which we don't look on too favorably in retrospect. So some of the modern iterations of this idea involve brain uploading, computerized consciousness, extreme life extension, and cryogenic reanimation. In the 21st century, transhumanism has also been adopted by a moral philosophy called Longtermism, which has arisen in the 2010s from this group of Oxford philosophers. And that's essentially the idea that positively influencing the long-term future is one of the key moral priorities of our time, which is a quote from William McCaskill in his 2022 book, What We Owe the Future. Long-termism is not transhumanist in the narrow sense of human enhancement, or not necessarily. It's not always about preventing individual death or lengthening individual life. It's about the life of the human species or of intelligent life in general. Some people don't limit it to humans. But it is transhumanist in the sense of unlocking the potential of humanity, as Huxley understood it. Defining the long-term future is important to understanding long-termism. One of the founding documents of long-termism is Nick Bostrom's 2013 paper, Existential Risk Prevention as Global Priority. In it, Bostrom argues that at the most conservative estimate, our planet will remain habitable for at least another billion years, meaning that the potential exists for at least 10 quadrillion lives of normal duration. He expands greatly from this conservative estimate, and his larger estimates range up to 10 to the 52nd lives, which is a ridiculously large number I won't try to contextualize. And this isn't limited to biological human lives or the Earth. His vision is that we'll figure out how to upload our brains into software, we'll send technology to do this all over the universe, and we'll just have as many people going as possible, emulated. And the purpose of all this speculation in the numbers is to quantify the loss that an existential risk would cause. So the idea of existential risk is really central to long-termism. And as Thomas Moynihan argues in the 2024 book, X Risk, it's a recent development in human thought. It's founded, Moynihan thinks, on two main assumptions. First, that human moral standards are not laws of nature, which you'll see a tie into the abolition of man there. And secondly, that conscious alien life doesn't exist. So if humans die out, then consciousness is gone in the universe, nothing is left, no one's left to experience good or bad, and everything's over. And this is echoed differently by McCaskill and Toby Ord, who focus instead of on the concept of value, that's the amount of well-being experienced by humans. But they all agree that existential risk, such as nuclear war or civilizational collapse, poses immense and unrecoverable dangers. Moynihan contrasts existential risk with apocalyptic religious philosophies, such as that of Christianity. He writes that extinction rests upon an appreciation that the universe is utterly unresponsive to our moral wishes and sense of justice. Where apocalypse secures the sense of an ending, extinction anticipates the ending of sense. This parallels an idea Lewis proposed in his essay, The Funeral of a Great Myth. In his description of the great myth of the 19th and early 20th centuries, life arises by chance, struggles its way to complexity, and eventually humanity develops science and outgrows savagery and superstition, placing us in the modern era. But the myth doesn't stop there. Instead, it, like Christianity, places us in the middle of a cosmic drama. Lewis writes that through eugenics and psychoanalysis, a race of demigods will rule the planet, in some versions, the galaxy. In other words, a transhuman race has emerged. And he continues, man has become God, all is a blaze of glory. And yet the myth ends in a twist. Life will be banished without hope of return from every cubic inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness. Lewis set out to give this myth a funeral oration, but it seems to have risen from the grave. Moynihan and other transhumanists have bought into the idea of progress towards a divine state for humanity. However, the ultimate fate of the universe, cold, dead, and unable to accommodate life, is rarely mentioned. Humanity should struggle against death, even though this struggle will eventually be futile. And while progress has been the rule and remains a goal, it's not inevitable. Existential risk threatens not just human life, but human potential, an idea that dates at least back to Haldane in 1927. These ideas are answered throughout Lewis's work, but a place to start is the abolition of man. In Lewis's view, the temporality of humanity does not mean the temporality of morals or values. In his words, objective value means that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is. Values are baked into the universe and thus will outlive humans. This is easier to come to through theism, but Lewis didn't think it was necessary. The cosmic trilogy also parallels transhumanist ideas, especially in the portrayal of its villains. In the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, the scientist Weston is called before the ruling angel of Mars, Malacandra, and gives an account of his own version of transhumanism. Weston says, "Men go jump off each world before it deads, on and on, see?" in his broken Malacandran. And Malacandra responds with, "And when all are dead?" which silences Weston. Later, Malacandra gives his diagnosis of humanity. They are wise enough to see the death of their kind approaching, but not wise enough to endure it. Weston is preaching an early version of space colonialism, and the response from the divine is that extinction is something to be endured, not fought. As Malacandra continues, "The weakest of my people does not fear death. It is the bent one, the Lord of your world, who wastes your lives and befouls them with flying from what you know will overtake you in the end." The same attitude is carried towards transhumanism in That Hideous Strength. Here, the villain is not an individual, but an organization, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, or NICE. At first, it's portrayed as a bureaucratic agency whose goals are comically hard to discover. But those goals are eventually revealed to be world domination and the immortalization of its high officials by perfusing their heads with blood. Lewis plays up the horror in the situation, and the head is actually kept alive through demonic power, not technology. But there's still a clear parallel to modern transhumanist goals, especially those that deal with preserving our consciousness in artificial media. Both ends of the trilogy, the first and the last book, address different technological issues with the same moral principle. Lewis thinks that it's better for humanity to accept its death rather than to perform evil or unnatural acts in an attempt to avert it. In Gilbert Maylander's words, summarizing Lewis, there are things we might do to survive, or to help our species survive, or even just suffer less, which it would be nonetheless wrong or dishonorable to do. The second book of the trilogy, Perelandra, gives an excellent image of this principle. It connects the trilogy morally and also provides an important thematic twist in its portrayal of its villain. In Perelandra, Weston is possessed by the devil and now called the Unman. He gives an analogy of life being a thin rind of goodness on a planet whose center is full of death, decay, and darkness. To thicken the rind by 1 centimeter, to live 1 week, 1 day, 1/2 hour longer, that's the only thing that matters, he says. This is distinct from the Western of Out of the Silent Planet, who claims to be concerned about humanity as a whole, and from the Nice in That Hideous Strength, who also claim to be trying to improve society. The Unman gives us a look beyond the facade of public concern to the egoism that underlies it, allowing the reader later to see the nice for the lie that it turns out to be. The same philosophy might underlie the movement for life extension. Perelandra also offers the antidote to the disease it diagnoses in its moral principle of accepting the given good, which the Green Lady and Ransom both struggle with. And the image that's given in here is of swimming swimming against a wave that's pushing you away from God's will and choosing to walk with the Creator in what he desires for you. This is why Weston's mission is misguided in the first book, and Perelandra's imagery of Eden cements the Christian morals underlying the trilogy. And as Ransom tells the company at the end of That Hideous Strength, "You have obeyed and waited. It will often happen like that." So the idea is you do what God wants you to do, so that God's will is enacted, and you don't really have a say in the matter. In his essay, The World's Last Night, Lewis carries out this principle in expressing a lack of concern about the consequences of nuclear war, about existential risk, even though the term didn't exist yet. "I don't think the bomb will kill us all," Lewis writes, "but suppose it did. As a Christian, I take it for granted that human history will someday end, and I am offering omniscience no advice as to the best date for that consummation. It's a good quote, but is that kind of eschatological apathy what Christianity calls for? On the one hand, the statement tracks with Christianity. No one but the Father knows the day of the second coming, and God's purposes are going to be realized regardless of what we do. But it also neglects Christ's ministry, teaching, and healing, and even Lewis's own views as seen in the Cosmic Trilogy and elsewhere. The analogy in Perelandra involves an active participation, as the Green Lady compares it to swimming against a wave that's trying to pull you somewhere else. Similarly, Ransom realizes that his presence on Venus is as a warrior to take down the unmanned by direct and violent action. This doesn't line up with Christians passively waiting for God's will to be enacted. As Fedorov thought, and as transhumanists believe, humanity does have some role to play in the new creation. However, that role is not in making humanity something beyond ourselves. That's accomplished by the resurrection. And if we attempt it, as Lewis warned in The Abolition of Man, we risk instead making ourselves less than human. Our role instead is to keep humanity human, resisting the forces that dehumanize us in preparation for God's redemption of our nature. I believe that Christians and transhumanists both have things to learn from one another. Transhumanists believe firmly in their causes and channel their belief into action. For example, McCaskill gives, I believe, 20% or so of his income every year to charities. So that's a good thing. And that kind of action that arises from our beliefs is at risk if we just see ourselves as bystanders to what God's going to do regardless. Seeing ourselves instead as co-creators and participants in the redemption of the cosmos could restore some urgency to the church. This doesn't mean promoting computerized consciousness or space colonization, but it does mean fostering the imagination needed to be more than spectators of the end of the world. Lewis's work offers both a warning and a reassurance to Christians in a transhumanist age. We should not pursue the power of transhumanism, and we do not carry its responsibility. But transhumanists pull in the other direction, challenging us to walk the line Christ walked, preaching and believing in what Lewis calls the invasion of God into our world, while also being attuned to the healing that's needed in front of us. We can love humanity in its brokenness, look forward to a day when God will make us more than human, and do all we can to bring God's kingdom to earth. What we can do may be very little, but that very little still matters. Thank you.